Give Pat a warm welcome.
Yeah. Hi, how do you do? I'm going to just be a bit sketchy, and I'm being inspired by the previous speakers to add to or subtract from. Look, I'm here with this bag. Why? Last week we did another protest down by the federal building, and I brought this with me. And I said, look at this. My hopes for peace are as frayed as this bed. So many years I've been walking around with this piece of poster board, and still the wars go on and on. Okay, so I'm not very keen on the fact of stressing the financial use we could make of the money for war. War is wrong. In and of itself, it's wrong in every way. Let's start out by telling a little personal story. Some of you know this story, but there are so many new faces here that I'll tell it. When I was 8 years old, many years ago, I came home from school once on a winter day in January, and I noticed a crowd of people in front of my house. Didn't seem right. Those days you used to go home for lunch from school at 11:30 until 1 o'clock. And when I got home, I discovered why this crowd were on the front lawn, because my mom and dad had just received the news of my brother's death at the end of World War II, near the end of World War II. All my brothers and sisters, my older brothers and sisters, were home from work, consoling my mom and dad. I remember that they took my little red jacket off me and put a somber color coat on me for me to go back to school that afternoon. In the months that followed, I watched my mother suffer from the loss of her firstborn, her son, Eugene. 4 years later, she died herself of cancer. From brought on, we were always convinced in the family by the terrible grief she suffered over the death of her first son. So from the time I was 8 years old until today, I've never stopped fighting against wars. They're good for nothing. They don't bring anything to anybody. When there's a war, I think of the Iranian moms and dads who will go through that same thing that my family did. So that's my history in the anti-war movement, and from that time to this, I've kept up that battle. In 1972, I left the United States to go to live in Europe so that I wouldn't have to pay taxes to support the Vietnam War. I had the opportunity to live abroad for a long, long time and to learn how the United States is seen from afar. It was in Dublin, Ireland, when I was living and working there, that I first heard about the first 9/11. I was there when that happened, when the coup in Chile took place, when, no, I'm not going to think of his name now, but you know the good socialist leader was killed by the CIA. And I remember in my naivete, you know, what? The CIA? And I had to learn how the rest of the world knows exactly how the United States government runs, and we, our own American citizens, don't know it. Okay, so I'm going to touch on a few points. My favorite mottos, I brought this with me when I was interviewed by Dan York during the campaign. Full spectrum dominance is not defense. Now, where did this phrase, full spectrum dominance, come from? I don't know how I happened to run across it, but it formed a part of the policy document of the United States. And I don't think most of us realize that this whole, policy formation about war is a full-time job in Washington. So this National Defense Strategy document declared that the goal of the Defense Department in the United States is to have full spectrum dominance over any possible adversary. It means on the land, on the sea, under the sea, in cyberspace, and of course now our wonderful president extending it into space, so that in whatever sphere of military activity, the United States will have full spectrum dominance. Now I ask, why do we call it a Department of Defense? Dominance is not defense. Dominance causes you to need defense, as one of the speakers has said. How do you feel when somebody tries to dominate you? You don't feel good toward them. You feel resentment. You feel anger. You feel revolt. And that's what our Defense Department does. Not to defend us, but to create enemies and to create blowback. Now, I do think that it's worth a hint that we all should get to study the progression of policy making. I went to look it up to see where did I get that phrase, how did I run across that phrase, full spectrum dominance. Well, the newest doctrine, well, first let me explain the process. Every time there's a new president, the White House gets together with his cabinet and advisors, and they write a document called the National Security Strategy. Comes from the White House, from the executive branch, and that's passed on down to the Defense Department. And the Secretary of Defense then, with his helpers, writes another document called... Who are we? Who are we cheering?
They're beeping at you.
Okay. They write another document called the National Defense Strategy. Then the National Defense Strategy from the Secretary of Defense is passed down to the generals and the Joint Force, and they write a document called the National Military Strategy. And it's in this National Military Strategy that I found that expression, full spectrum dominance. Now, I didn't realize that it's this National Military Strategy that then forms the basis for the National Defense Authorization Act, the one we're all referring to. We call it the military budget, but it's much more than the budget. It's the budget based on the acceptance of that national defense policy and that national military policy. So it made me realize that, you know, our small demonstrations, our letter writing, occasionally our getting an audience with one of the senators or the representatives doesn't have much chance of influencing that National Defense Authorization Act, which only is presented to us, at least in most of what I read, as the budget, the military budget, the military budget. But the military budget is actually based on these policy documents. So the notion that after the information has gone from the national security to the national defense to the national military, it's suddenly going to get changed when they draw up the budget is a fantasy. The policy has been approved, and it's very highly unlikely that it will get changed in the middle of the budget process. Okay, now, so my feeling is that we've all got to get much more informed. We've got to become acquainted with those policy documents, and we've got to question not the money that's put toward it, but the basic aims and goals that are listed in the policy. Okay, let me bring up one other interesting point that interested me when I was studying them today, preparing this talk. When in the two national military policies that came out of the Obama administration, and I'm not going to paint Obama as a wonderful peace candidate or anything like that, but at least in his national military policy document, he made reference to things like the community of nations or international community. In the newest policy document produced by the Trump administration, none of those phrases occur. Our world is referred to as a competitive space. Nothing about community, nothing about cooperation. A space of competition. And the phrase full spectrum dominance has been changed to be a space in which no competition will be permitted. The goal of our defense policy is that China and Russia will not be able to even compete. Well, you know, it really made me reflect when I listened to this. The greatest capitalist society in the world that claims that competition is the basis of progress and growth won't allow competition in political terms. No socialist country, no communist country is allowed to show what it could do, is allowed to compete in the public forum against world capitalism, against American capitalism. So I found that a profoundly disturbing trend. The inconsistency of promoting competition within capitalism and the demoting of competition between societies. They talk about the fact that a socialist country never succeeded because we never let them succeed. We've decided ahead of time that they will not be allowed to compete.